Ready? Okay. Welcome, everybody, to those of you who are here in person and those who may be watching online. Glad you could watch us today. I'm going to be talking today about some of the history of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the Northern Irish peace process. I was part of a group of about 15 United Methodist pastors who, over the last year, took part in a peace-building cohort. And one of the things that we did is we met in the fall with an Irish Methodist minister whose name is Gary Mason. And I'm going to be telling you a lot more about him and his work in the next hour. But we met with him in the fall at Lake Junaluska. And then the week after Easter this year, we spent a week in Northern Ireland, really in Belfast, learning about the history and also the peace process and how they did things to make for peace. So that's what I'm going to talk about some tonight. First of all, Ireland. Where is even Ireland? There was one minister that we talked to that worked in a ministry with refugees. And he said that sometimes refugees come there to Northern Ireland and they ask, where are we? And that's a good question. As a matter of fact, that's at the heart of the question and the heart of the struggle and the heart of the conflict is, where are we? When you're in Northern Ireland, where are you? Are you in England? Or are you in Ireland? Are you in some kind of weird twilight zone in between? You are both in Ireland and you're in Great Britain when you're in Northern Ireland. And that is at the heart of the dilemma that faces Northern Ireland. So, why is there so much conflict there? Well, it goes back, you could trace it back to the 12th century. If you really wanted to go back to the Norman invaders who invaded Ireland in search of places to conquer. You could trace it back to King Henry VIII, who in the 6th century, the King of England, proclaimed that, you know what, I'm not only the King of England, I'm also the King of Ireland. And for some reason, the people of Ireland didn't like that. But guess what? King Henry VIII had a bigger army than they did. So that settled it. So he subjugated all of Ireland really in the 16th century. But you could trace it back also to some significant developments in the 17th century. What happened then? In the 17th century, a lot of people from Scotland here and northern England immigrated to the northern part of Ireland. And by that time, people from England and Scotland were Protestant. Earlier, when I was talking about King Henry VIII, the division between Protestants and Catholics did not exist. Okay? So the heart of the conflict goes back further than the division between Protestants and Catholics. Say more about that later. But in the 17th century, settlers from Scotland and northern England settled in the northern part of Ireland. And this part of Ireland was known at that time and has been really ever since. The English called it Ulster. The northern part of Ireland is what the English called Ulster. And when they came over, they settled in high concentrations in Ulster. And basically, they set up a plantation system whereby they made money off of plantation systems that they had set up in which the native Irish therefore became tenants in a land that they used to own. And that's where the economic inequalities really started, was because people from Scotland and northern England came to settle here and they started running the place. And Irish people who were basically Catholic lost the land that they once thought of as their ancestral home to people from Scotland and northern England. That happened way back in the 17th century. So this is a long, long history. Now so there was growing resentment between the people of Ireland and the people who governed Ireland from England. This all bubbled up in the Easter Uprising of 1916. Ireland was under the control of Britain. But in 1916, a group of Catholic Republicans, and by the way, when I say Republicans, it has nothing to do with what in the United States we call Republicans. A Republican is somebody who believes that all of Ireland should be one republic. And so they are called Republicans. Other people, predominantly Protestant people in Northern Ireland, are sometimes called loyalists. That is, they are loyal to the crown. They're loyal to England. And they will fly the Union Jack of Great Britain. There are some parts of the city of Belfast today that fly a Union Jack. There are other parts of Belfast, even today, that will fly the tricolor Irish flag. And so if you are a Protestant living in Belfast, you probably live in East Belfast where there's a Union Jack. If you are a Catholic, you probably live in West Belfast where they fly the tricolor Irish flag. And anyway, what I was saying, 1916, there was a Republican Catholic group who led a revolt in Dublin, and they actually took over the post office in Dublin. And they said, you know what? This is no longer a British post office. This is an Irish post office. And Britain said, no, you're wrong. And the people in Dublin said, oh no, we're Ireland. We're not English. And they flew a different flag. They took down the Union Jack and put up an Irish flag in 1916 on Easter Day. And that rebellion was squashed by the British military, and the leaders of that rebellion in 1916 were executed, and British control and domination was reinstituted across Ireland in 1916, despite the Easter Uprising. And by the way, when you go to Belfast today, or really anywhere in Northern Ireland, if you see somebody wearing a lapel pin that is an Easter lily, guess what they're saying? They're saying the Easter Uprising was right. They're saying, I'm Catholic, I'm a Republican, I'm Ireland, I'm for the unification of all Ireland. And this is my badge, an Easter lily, because it goes back to the Easter Uprising of 1916. And if you wear an Easter lily in certain parts of Belfast, in East Belfast today, you are, as they used to say, cruising for a bruising. You're asking for a fight. And for 30 years, between 1968 and 98, you were asking for violence, and you often got it, just for wearing a lapel pin that was an Easter lily, because that is a signal that the Easter Uprising of 1916 was right. Well, that rebellion, though, was squashed, but the growing resentment of the Irish people continued to increase. They continued to want to be independent of England. Does this sound familiar to anybody in American history? Okay. So what happened after World War I, in 1921, England, Britain, gave independence to most of Ireland, and they became the Republic of Ireland. But they wanted to hold on to Northern Ireland, and it is still to this day under British control. But that is highly contested. And they have, one of the sources of their problems is what they sometimes call the double minority. That is, in Ireland today, Protestants often perceive themselves as a persecuted minority. But depending on where you are, Catholics also perceive themselves as a persecuted minority. That is, in all of Ireland, Protestants are in the minority, and they feel like, therefore, they have to fight in order just to survive and maintain their identity. But in Northern Ireland, Protestants are the majority and Catholics are the minority, and they feel like they have to fight in order to maintain their identity and their traditions. So both sides think that they are a persecuted, embattled minority, and therefore often think that they are justified in using violence to maintain their identity. That is the heart of the problem. And it ain't been resolved. It's been put on hold, thank goodness, for a good while. And we'll get more to that later. But I just wanted to, that's the sense of where things are and where they've come from in Northern Ireland. Okay? Now, how big is Ireland? The whole island of Ireland is smaller than North Carolina. And the Republic of Ireland is about the size of South Carolina, just to give you a sense of how large an area we're talking about. Now, when we were in Belfast for the week after Easter, we met with a lot of people and had conversations with people on both sides of this conflict. And when you hear their stories, you can understand their point of view. You may not approve of it or want to justify some of their actions, but you begin to understand a little bit of their point of view. For example, here are two men that we talked with. On the left is Jerry McConville. On the right is Harry Stockman. These two men once wanted to kill each other. I mean that quite literally. As teenagers, they had grown up on opposite sides of the divided city of Belfast, separated from each other by barricades and checkpoints, sworn enemies who sometimes threw rocks at each other. If you were a Protestant in Belfast, your only contact with a Catholic was probably looking over this big wall, looking down at some Catholics and throwing rocks at them. That was the extent of your contact with Catholics. Catholics the same way. Their only interaction with Protestants is to look down from a big tall wall and throw rocks at Protestants. Okay? So nobody's innocent in this conflict, okay? So I'm not taking sides. I am saying nobody's innocent, and nobody is a horrible person either. Although some people did some horrible things that we'll talk about. Jerry on the left was a Roman Catholic from an Irish nationalist family. That meant his people, who were the minority in Northern Ireland, wanted to see all of Ireland become independent from the United Kingdom and be reunited with a predominantly Catholic country, the Republic of Ireland. Now, Harry, on the other hand, on the right side, had grown up Protestant. And he was from a loyalist family. In other words, a family that was still loyal to the British Crown. And his people, who made up the majority in Northern Ireland, wanted to stay loyal to the Queen and remain a part of the predominantly British Isles. Each one of these two men believed that the other was ruining their country. So they grew up from fearful teenagers into angry young men. And Jerry and Harry advanced from throwing rocks at each other to shooting bullets in each other's direction. They each joined competing paramilitary armies, groups, which were kind of like violent gangs in order to defend their people from the angry, violent young men on the other side. Jerry became part of the Provisional Irish Republican Army. You may know what that means, the IRA. And he joined the IRA after loyalists had set fire to his Catholic neighborhood, leaving many people homeless, and after he had witnessed the occupying British soldiers ransack some of his neighborhood's houses and even kill his 14-year-old friend, whose name was Desi. Now, that's his point of view. But Jerry thought of himself as a freedom fighter who was trying to free his people from colonial oppression. That's how he viewed himself. But on the other side, Harry, after witnessing British soldiers brutally killed by members of Jerry's IRA, well, he joined the Ulster Volunteer Force, or the UVF, which was a Protestant paramilitary group. And he did so in his mind to defend his family and his people and his way of life. And the police weren't doing a good enough job, so they thought, we better pitch in and help. So they wanted to save their community from the depraved terrorists of the IRA. And he viewed it as his mission to get rid of people like Jerry. Both Harry and Jerry became what was called gunmen, people who used violence against others who were different from them. At one point, Harry and his friends unsuccessfully attempted to kill Jerry. Both men wound up going to prison, okay? Thousands of young men, both Protestant and Catholic, wound up going to prison because they got involved in these violent paramilitary groups, okay? And we're just talking a relatively small country about the size of South Carolina, okay? But while they were both in prison, both Jerry and Harry had time to rethink what they were doing with their life, And they both realized while spending years in prison as young men, this violence is getting us nowhere. It is only increasing the pain and the death of everybody. And when they got out of prison several years later, they devoted themselves to telling young people on their side, hey, violence ain't going to do you no good. It's only going to contribute to this cycle in which we're killing each other, causing pain. And so now, today, both Jerry and Harry talk with young people in the inner city, in Belfast and other places, and try to convince them to work out their problems and to resolve all of their anger in ways that are nonviolent. These two men, they're not best friends, okay? So they're not buddies. I don't want to give that impression. But they do meet together once a month. And they meet together as a way of checking in with each other and saying, hey, in this part of Belfast coming up this month, there's going to be a group of Protestants who are going to go on a march. And they're going to be wearing orange. William of Orange. I'll say more about that later. And I just wanted you to know so that you could tell your Catholic friends not to be frightened or reactive to that. Just kind of stay back from it. Let them have their march. Don't start throwing rocks at them so that things can go peacefully and not cause a riot. Same way on the other side. Harry meets with him once a month and says, hey, there's a group of Catholics they're gonna meet, and they're gonna be wearing their Easter lilies. I'm just telling you now. And just stay out of their way, let them have their little march so that we can go on and hopefully not have a riot and get people killed. So they meet together with each other once a month so that they can, try to negotiate terms and make sure, or at least minimize the chances of violence and violent sectarian conflict. Both of these men warn others about the dangers that you fall into when you view another group of human beings as something a little bit less than human. And both are now giving their lives to make sure their grandchildren never experience the kind of societal conflict and trauma that they have. Jerry, the Catholic, guess what? His grandson married a Protestant last year. People can change. People can change. All right, so let's say a little bit more about these divisions. I mentioned orange. See, these are the two flags. By the way, in the city of Belfast, their downtown, their city hall, sometimes you go there and they're flying a Union Jack. Sometimes you go there and they're flying the flag of Ireland. They have to work this out, agree amongst themselves, okay? But the orange side, that's the Protestant side, they trace their roots back to William of Orange, King William, Prince of Orange, who squashed a rebellion of Catholics in 1690, okay? So that's why when they go marching, they like to wear their orange. And it's a way of saying, hey, we're celebrating this guy that killed a lot of Catholics. That's what they're doing. And same way that Irish, when they have a march, they wear white in celebration of Easter. Or sometimes they wear green, which is a color associated with Ireland. And they just, this is their way of asserting Irish independence. As they've been doing, as the Republic of Ireland has been doing since 1921. All right, there is one of the, you go to Belfast today and you see all kinds of murals. All over the place there are murals. And you can tell whether you're in a Catholic neighborhood or a Protestant neighborhood by what kind of murals they got on the side of their buildings. Okay? This is obviously taken in a Protestant neighborhood. Okay? A Catholic neighborhood is not going to be celebrating King William. Okay? He's the one who squashed a Catholic rebellion in 1690. Okay? But that's just emblematic of what I call the weaponization of history. If you're a Protestant and you want to reach out in love to your Catholic friends, you're not going to throw William of Orange in their face. That'll only inflict further harm. But there are some Protestant neighborhoods and they say, you know what? We're going to celebrate William of Orange. What do you think about that? And that's just increasing the resentment when you do things like that, right? All right. So, there was this division in 1921, Northern Ireland, and that resentment just kind of simmered beneath the surface until about the year 1698. And from 1968, from 1968 to 1998, there was horrible violence throughout Northern Ireland. First of all, they tried to remain peaceful, okay? The Catholics were demonstrating for their rights, their political rights, voting rights, rights in terms of jobs and housing. What it was like this. Okay, so the British government said, okay, every household gets 2 votes. And you might say, oh, okay, well, all right, that's all right. But the thing is, a Protestant family would have 2 adults living in the house usually, and they would get their 2 votes, fine. But a Catholic family might have, 6 adults living in their house, but still only get 2 votes. So you can tell right there, Catholics are not getting equal voting rights with Protestants, okay, in the early 1960s. That led, in turn, to more government officials being disproportionately Protestant, and Catholic government officials being disproportionately in much smaller numbers. That was also reflected in the police. There were lots of Protestant police, but very few Catholic police. There are lots of Protestant jobs in the government for Protestants, but not much for Catholics. There are lots of housing opportunities for Protestants, but not much for Catholics. Lots of jobs for Protestants, but not many for Catholics. So all of that came together, and finally in the mid-60s, I would say, Catholics began demonstrating for their rights. They modeled themselves largely after the civil rights movement in the United States that was taking place. They saw themselves as an extension of the U.S. civil rights movement. But that was what Catholics were demonstrating for. But Protestants had a reaction to that, right? And there was one particular Protestant minister whose name was Reverend Ian Paisley from the Free Presbyterian Church. And he was saying, those dirty Catholics, they pretend to be peaceful, but you know what? They're just agents of the Pope, and they're trying to make Catholics of us all, and we got to stand up to them. And so he stirred up Protestant fears and anger. And remember, they thought of themselves as the persecuted minority. We got to stand up to these Catholics who are trying to take over. This is what he preached. And he said these protesters are pretending to be nonviolent, but you know what? They're just tools of the IRA and the Pope. And he stood up one time when the Pope was addressing the European Parliament. He stood up and shouted, "The Pope is the Antichrist." He held signs saying the Pope is the Antichrist. He hated Catholics. And he stirred up lots of Protestants to hate Catholics. This is the danger of religious zeal turned bad. It happened. I mean, compare that to Martin Luther King in our country. Anyway, in 1968, there was a national civil rights march from Belfast to Londonderry. And they were basically Catholic, Republican, Irish people who wanted their rights as Catholics to be recognized by Protestants. And they went on a march from Belfast to Londonderry, which they modeled after the march from Selma to Montgomery. They intentionally said, we're doing what Dr. King did. They modeled themselves after the American Civil Rights Movement. They said, we're going to be completely nonviolent. And they marched all the way to Londonderry. It was about the same distance as from Selma to Montgomery. But at the end of that march, they were so brutally and violently attacked by Protestant leaders, including police, that they lost all hope in the power of nonviolence. They didn't have a Martin Luther King who was strongly committed to nonviolence to lead them. So their commitment to nonviolence was very short-lived. And they said, you know what, if Protestants aren't going to listen to us when we march nonviolently, well, we'll just use some other tactics. And they started using violence. And that gave rise to a new wave of activity from the IRA. Here's a mural that celebrates the IRA that's in Belfast today. See how they have the tricolor flag of Ireland. And when the IRA began their attacks, there was a counter attack, series of attacks by what they called the UDA, which was the Ulster Defense Association, which was basically Protestants, British controlled. And they said, well, you know, if the IRA is going to attack our neighborhoods, we need to defend ourselves because even our own police aren't defending us enough. So we're going to form these vigilante groups and we're going to start fighting off these Catholics who are trying to kill us. And you see, they both conceived of themselves as a persecuted minority just trying to defend themselves. I think this, one of the murals that we saw was in celebration of the UDA that was formed in 1971, and their motto was prepared for peace but ready for war. And you see the gunmen there. there's another mural in celebration of another Protestant paramilitary group called the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but there's something very important to see in this picture. And if you don't remember anything else I say tonight, remember this. UVF, they were masked gunmen killing Catholics. And you know what this says right here? I don't know if you can read it. This is East Belfast, where the Protestants were, of course. You wouldn't find a mural like this in West Belfast. But this says, God and Ulster. And if you see murals for the IRA, you know what they say? They say, for God and Ireland. So you have people whose motto is, for God and Ulster, killing people whose motto is, for God and Ireland. You know what you call that? You call that taking God's name in vain. Whenever you say God and, you're in trouble. We can never equate our own agendas, even our national agendas, as though they were as important as God. Because when we do that, we are setting the stage for all kinds of violence. And that's exactly what happened in Northern Ireland for 30 years. In 1969, after loyalist bombings and competing marches, rioting breaks out in Derry and Belfast. If you've seen the movie Belfast, you saw rioting break out. That movie tells the story of a particular family going through this. But this is what they were these kinds of riots were what they were going through. Conflict between nationalists, loyalists, and the police. After this went on for several years, finally British soldiers are called in to restore order and keep the peace. Now, at first, the British soldiers were welcomed. The British soldiers were welcomed by both sides. They thought, oh good, at least we get to return to, at least we can be normal now and go back to normalcy and have some peace and some quiet, and these British soldiers will keep the peace for everybody. That's what they thought at first. For a few months that was the case. And even Protestants and Catholics would both bring snacks and bring tea, afternoon tea, to the British soldiers. And there was even a friendly rivalry. It's like, who could provide the British soldiers with the best tea and crumpets? The Catholics or the Protestants? And the Protestants would say, oh, we have better tea. Here, take some of our tea. And the Catholics would say, oh, no, here, have some of our tea. It's better. And so there was this friendliness at first that lasted a couple months. But then the Catholics or the Republicans started to say, hey, wait a minute. These British soldiers are occupying our land, and they're a lot more harsh in the Catholic communities than they are in the Protestant communities. In the Catholic communities, they raid our homes at night, in the middle of the night, and go searching. And they don't do that in Protestant neighborhoods, even though we know that same kind of stuff happens. And so there came to be a growing resentment of the British soldiers from the Catholic sections in Belfast. So much so that the British soldiers became targets for the IRA. And a dozen of them were murdered. And so that only, of course, increased the tension and the animosity and the hatred between Protestants and Catholics. In 1972, there was a civil rights march in Derry, Londonderry, and it turned into Bloody Sunday. And what it was is British troops opened fire on Protestant protesters, even though they were unarmed, and killed 13 unarmed Protestant protesters on Bloody Sunday. How many of you like the rock band U2? Anybody? They have a song called Bloody Sunday, and that's what this is about. And they also have a song that says, where the streets have no names, You know that one? Of course, U2 is an Irish rock band. And what they're saying is, in Belfast, you can tell whether somebody's Protestants or Catholic by the name of the street they live on. And they were talking about a kingdom. They're a very Christian rock band. Spoiler alert. But they were singing about a kingdom where the streets had no name. In other words, where Catholics and Protestants weren't killing each other. Anyway, 13 unarmed Protestant protesters killed in 1972 on Bloody Sunday. Of course, the IRA had a response to that, and they set off a series of bombs in Belfast on what was called Bloody Friday. It was retaliation. Reciprocal attacks, bombings, assassinations, and acts of violence ensue. If you move forward into the 1980s, there were the hunger strikes. What it was the Catholic, that is Republican, prisoners who were imprisoned because of their participation in violence with the IRA, they started saying, hey, you know what? We're not just ordinary criminals. We are prisoners of war. We demand to be treated as prisoners of war. We're not going to wear uniforms that you give to ordinary prisoners. We are freedom fighters. We're not terrorists. We're freedom fighters. We're fighting for the independence of Ireland. You can imagine in United States history, if the Patriots had been arrested by British authorities, and they would have said, well, we're prisoners of war. And the British authorities would have said, no, you're just ordinary criminals. See the difference? Well, these Catholic, Irish, Republican prisoners started saying, we're not just criminals. We're prisoners of war. We demand to be treated according to the Geneva Convention. And when they weren't, sometimes they went on hunger strikes. The first person to go on a hunger strike and die of starvation was Bobby Sands. That's a mural of a picture of him in 1981. And in 1981, actually 10 IRA prisoners died while they were on hunger strike. And that just fueled the violence every time one of the prisoners died. Now here's some statistics. In Northern Ireland, see, British called it Northern Ireland. The Irish people called it the North of Ireland. See the difference? Anyway, from 1968 to 1998, there were 1.7 million people. That was the population of Northern Ireland. In that time span, there were 47,000 injuries due to political violence, sectarian violence. There were 36,000 shootings in that little country. 30,000 people went through the penal system because of their involvement in the violence of one of these paramilitary groups. 22,000 armed robberies took place because these paramilitary groups needed money to survive. There were 16,000 bombings that took place in Northern Ireland during those 16,000 bombings and 4,000 deaths. If you were to extrapolate that into the United States, if something like that happened in the United States, it would have looked like this. There would have been 9 million injuries, 7 million shootings, 6 million political prisoners, 3 million bombings, and 700,000 deaths during that time. That's how violent it was. Gary Mason, whom I'll talk about in a minute, was a boy growing up in the 1970s. And he said, growing up in Belfast, and he said this. He said, if he heard on the evening news that a Catholic had been killed in Belfast, he knew that by the time he woke up in the morning, there would have been a Protestant who was killed. That's really something for a boy to know as he goes to bed each night. But that's the extent of the violence. We talked with John Brewer. That's this guy. He was a professor, a sociologist at Queen's University in Belfast. He studies the sociology of religion, particularly violence and religion. and why it is that religion sometimes turns violent or becomes a cover for violence. And he just took us through how this can happen. Usually conflicts like this aren't religious at all. They're not religious. They're not fighting over different understandings of Scripture or the Eucharist or transubstantiation or the Pope or Lutheran doctrine or something else. They're not arguing over that. They're arguing over political disagreements about which government should run a country. But what happens is the religion gets sucked into it. And so religion became, after the fact, a justification for the political fighting and violence. And it became a justification for looking at the other group as somehow morally inferior or against God. And Dr. Brewer quoted a Bob Dylan line. He said, "You don't count the dead when God is on your side." In other words, if I know God's on my side, it doesn't matter how many people I kill on the other side, because God's on my side. That's the danger of God and that we were talking about earlier. And part of what he wanted to warn us about was the dangerous fusion that happens when politics uses religion for its own purposes. Hear me? When politics uses religion for its own purposes, that is a recipe for disaster. And it has a toxic effect, not only on religious institutions, but political institutions as well. And that's what happened in Northern Ireland for over 30 years. Well, how did they come out of that? All right, this is Gary Mason. He's an Irish Methodist minister who hosted us. During the Troubles, he started bringing together Protestant Catholics in small groups to start hearing each other's stories. And they found that when you start hearing the stories of other people and how they've been suffering too, that it's not just my side that's been suffering, but their side has been suffering too, you start to find a common humanity. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes years and years and sometimes decades. But relationships can be formed, and that is the essence of peace building. Those relationships, when you get to know the other person as a human being, and they're more than just the boogeyman who killed my family. They're a human being, a child of God, and they've had family members killed too. And when you share that vulnerability, what happens is the brokenness is not multiplied, but somehow some healing starts to take place. Gary was recognized by the Queen of England, for his peace building efforts. That's just a picture of when he was recognized by the Queen. These are two people who had family members die in acts of violence during the Troubles. Okay? The one on the left, his name was Alan. His wife was killed in an IRA bombing. For a long time, he hated the IRA, and he hated Catholics because of that. He turned to drinking, among other things, to self-medicate, to numb himself from the pain. The woman on the right, her son was killed by a Protestant vigilante group one night. And her unimaginable pain that she went through. And Gary brought people like this together, not under the spotlight, not in newspapers, but in small, informal gatherings where they got to know each other. And healing started to take place. And the man on the left, Alan, he went out one night after one of these conversations, and he couldn't help but invite his new Catholic friend with him. And they shared drinks at a bar one night, and he told more of his story, and his new Catholic friend said, "I'm sorry, that should never have happened." And that was very healing for him. It happened both ways. Healing started to take place. Anyway, the Good Friday Agreement finally happened in 1998, bringing, for the most part, 30 years of violence to a close. And what it said was, when both countries democratically vote to unite all of Ireland as one country, then we'll do it. Both governments are honor-bound to honor that. That hasn't happened yet. It may happen someday. I don't know. But at least in the meantime, they're not killing each other anymore. So it's a very significant agreement passed on Good Friday. I don't think there's any coincidence to the fact that that is called the Good Friday Agreement, because Christ, by his death on Good Friday, broke down the dividing walls, Paul says. They were assisted in that process by a U.S. Special Envoy, George Mitchell, who was a senator from Maine and was sent to Northern Ireland by President Clinton at the time. I'm going to skip over some things. There's a memorial of the IRA honoring the IRA. I want to tell you about Sammy, and then I'm going to save time for questions. We met with the high sheriff of Belfast. He served us tea in the tea room of City Hall in Belfast. Nice guy. But you know what? As a young man, he also got involved in violence and spent some time in prison. 30,000 people did. People just did it. And what he said was, these 30,000 political prisoners, they're not terrible people, but they got sucked into a terrible situation where they thought they had to use violence if they were going to defend their family. And out of love for their family and their tradition and their neighborhood, they thought they had to use violence. And they wound up going to prison. He also got turned around while he was in prison. Today, he's the High Sheriff of Belfast. And what that means is he's the representative of the King of England in Belfast. But in the tea room where he served us tea, there were two pictures at one end. One of them was the King of England, and one of them was the President of Ireland. He had pictures of them both and honored them both. And at the other end of the tea room, he had a picture of Nelson Mandela. Think about that. Sammy was a great guy, just incredibly gracious with us. There's one of the peace walls, barricades, barbed wire fences that separated Catholic and Protestant communities. There's a mural. I thought it was very provocative. It's a dove representing peace, of course, that's shot through by two arrows, one representing both sides. And that was like the hope for peace that had been killed by the violence, according to that mural. This is the Cathedral of Belfast, where we worshiped on that Sunday morning after Easter. And as Methodists, we were allowed to take part in that service, basically an Anglican service. Some of you know that the United Methodist Church recently came into a full communion agreement with the Episcopal Church, okay? We couldn't at the time. We could take part in the service. We even read some scripture and led some prayers, but we couldn't read the gospel reading. But when this full communion agreement comes into place, we can go into an Episcopal church and do the gospel reading. Anyway, but that's not the big point. The big point is, you see this right here? They call that the Spire of Hope. And it looks like glass or crystal, but they say that's the spire representing our aspirations for peace. That's the Cathedral of Belfast, where we worshiped on Sunday morning. I'm going to go quickly. That's the Europa Hotel, where we stayed. It's the most bombed hotel in the world. That made us feel real good staying there. But that's where diplomats often stayed. And during the days of the Troubles, it was often bombed. But it hasn't been bombed since the Good Friday Agreement. I don't think it's been bombed. That's me. I'm a member of Rotary, some of you know. And the Rotary Club meets at that Europa Hotel. And they had a sign that says they meet here every Monday. And I happened to be there on a Monday. And I went to the front desk and I said, "Where's the Rotary meeting?" And they said, "Oh, they're meeting in Dublin today." So I didn't get to go to a Rotary meeting. But the fact that they were meeting in Dublin says something. Because I'll tell you another story about that in a second. There's one of the murals. And I gotta fit this in. Some of you know I'm a C.S. Lewis fan, right? C.S. Lewis is from Belfast. From the Protestant section of Belfast, obviously. That is East Belfast. There used to be, on the side of that building, there used to be a mural like that with masked gunmen. But Gary, who was our host, got a commission to redo the side of that building, and now there's a mural of C.S. Lewis and the Lion and the Witch in the Wardrobe. Somebody from the BBC asked Gary, do you really think it makes a difference? And he said, let me ask you this way. There's a 6-year-old girl who wakes up every morning, and that's the first thing she sees, a mural of masked gunmen with their AK-47s ready to shoot somebody. That's what the 6-year-old girl sees every morning when she wakes up. Now she wakes up and she sees the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Do you think it makes a difference for that 6-year-old girl? Yeah, I think so. We also got to see the home of C.S. Lewis's childhood, and St. Mark's Church, which is the church where his grandfather was the priest. St. Mark, the symbol of Mark's gospel is the lion. So when he went to see his grandfather, he knocked on the rectory door and saw a lion there. And as a child, C.S. Lewis had that image of a lion emblazoned on his heart and mind. And if you know anything about the Chronicles of Narnia, you know that the lion, Aslan, represents Jesus. Anyway, lessons learned. I learned that peace is hard and conflict is easy. But it doesn't take any bravery or creativity or imagination to continue conflict and violence. It does take bravery and creativity and hard work and patience to work for peace. Many of the people who served prison terms were not terrible people. They were caught in a terrible situation. History can be weaponized, as I said before. The perils of religious nationalism. There's a phenomenon at work in our country right now. It's called Christian nationalism. You ever heard of it? Christian nationalism. Just think about that term, Christian nationalism. It's very unhealthy, both for the country as a whole and for Christianity. Remember what I said, never tie God to your own personal agenda. It's very dangerous. And I learned that people can change because I talked to a lot of people who did change. All right. What questions might you have in the last 7 minutes? Yes.
I thought the mothers of Ireland were the ones that really got together and promoted the peace agreement. Is that true?
A lot of that, yeah. To a large extent, yes. Mothers whose children had been lost on either side got together and said, we are sick and tired of losing our children to this violence, and we've got to do something about it. Both Protestant and Catholic mothers said that. Interestingly enough, Mother's Day in the United States came out of the Civil War, a group of mothers who said, we're tired of offering up our sons to be slaughtered in wars, and we're going to do something about it. Mother's Day was originally a peace day, coming out of Methodist women out of the Civil War. That's a side note. But a similar phenomenon happened in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. Mothers, yes, particularly got behind the Good Friday Agreement. We talked with the person who was in charge of the Yes campaign for the Good Friday Agreement. That is, the Good Friday Agreement, once it was drawn up, had to receive the approval of people from all over Ireland, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. They had a campaign to convince people, you got to vote for this. They had to get 2/3 of the population to vote for it in order for it to pass, and they did. And mothers, yes, played a very critical role in that. They did. What other questions might you have? I skipped over a lot, but that's all right. Oh, I'm glad to. Glad to. I was telling somebody earlier, on the way home, we were in the Dublin airport. That's in the Republic of Ireland. And we were flying back to Charlotte, and we were just waiting at the gate. And this big guy came up to us. And he said, I heard you talking about Belfast. That's mighty brave of you. And we're like, okay. He said, not many people come around here talking about Belfast. Okay. All right. He said, what are you doing here talking about Belfast? Well, we're just here to study the Irish peace process, you know. Well, whose side are you on? well, we're not really on anybody's side. We're just glad that there's not as much violence, but we don't really have a side. Well, you don't trust the IRA, do you? He said, well, I served in the British Army. I don't trust the IRA. They say they've decommissioned their weapons, but I don't believe it. They can pull them out at any moment and start all over again. Okay, you're all right. We're not arguing with you. But he got very heated, and it's like a tinderbox, you dropping a match and just... That's how deep people's emotions run over this. For some people, not everybody, some people. Yeah. There's a book called The Anatomy of Peace, and it talks about having a heart of war versus a heart of peace. And what it says is peace starts in your heart. And when you have a heart of peace towards others, you seek to connect with them and you recognize their common humanity. And that's the essence of peace building. If you have a heart of war towards others, you seek to prove that you're better than they are. And you dehumanize them and demonize them in such a way that justifies hatred and violence against them. And what the book says, and I'm giving a 1-minute summary of a long book, but what it says is, if you have a heart of peace, you will see in other people commonalities, and you will see bridges that can bring the two of you together rather than drive people apart. And that's the essence of peacemaking. And that's what some people in Northern Ireland are working their way through. It's a very slow process. It's a painful process because they've been through a lot of pain. The rate of alcoholism in Northern Ireland is incredible because so many people self-medicate to get over the trauma of the pain that they've experienced. But there's another way. And Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. They'll be called children of God. And that's as much a sermon as I'll give tonight. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, the purpose of this whole meeting, is it to share in other areas of the world?
Yes. I hope that as I was making points about Northern Ireland, that some blinkers were going off in your mind saying, oh. And I didn't always want to point them out to you because I wanted you to make the connections yourself. They're more powerful when you make the connections than when I make them for you. But I hope that the blinkers on your dashboard were going off when I was saying some of the things that I said tonight. Our nation is at the present time experiencing a high degree, as we all know, of polarization. And I'm not saying that there's a movie out right now called Civil War. Anybody seen it or heard about it? You have? I haven't seen it. I want to. But, of course, it's a fictional kind of apocalyptic account of what can happen when this sectarian violence goes to an extreme. I'm not saying that's going to happen in the United States, but I see pockets of it where we demonize one another with... If we disagree with somebody over some political point, we can demonize them, and we can therefore opens up paths to hatred and can lead to violence. There could be isolated examples of violence that we all think about and know about. They've never taken off on a broad scale like they did in Northern Ireland. But we see, and this year is an election year, and one of the things I tell people is, hey, folks, take it down a notch. Tell people on both sides, take it down a notch. And the best thing we can do is to get to know somebody personally of a different political party and recognize, hey, they're human beings too. And when we do that, we are doing the things that make for peace. We are approaching our lives with a heart of peace rather than a heart of war. And that's what we need to be doing. Yeah. Anything else? I could talk about this for a few more hours, but I'm not going to. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. If you think of other questions you want to talk with me about, please do so. And I hope I've given you something to think about tonight, something maybe to pray about. So God bless.